I'm going to just do a brief introduction for Ha-Joon, and we're very happy to have him here. He's, for your information, he's also a research associate of CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And can you all hear me? Okay. I can do this. Okay. And he's one of the world's most famous economists, actually. His last couple of quotes, the 23 things that they don't tell you about capitalism, has sold 700,000 copies, and 500,000 for the one previous, Bad Samaritans, The Myth of Free Trade, and The Secret History of Capitalism. Now, that's pretty good. I mean, I think that could make him certainly one of the most. Well, maybe Krugman or Stiglitz could get ahead of that, but I'm not even sure they sold as many of their books. And he has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, where he teaches economics to this day. Won the Leontief Prize in 2005. And I want to just say two other things. One is one of my favorite stories from Ha-Joon, where he said that if you ever see kind of epitomizes his view and his history of capitalism, where he says if you ever see someone who calls themselves a free trade economist driving a Toyota, you can go up to them and say, you're not a free trade economist at all, because it took more than 30 years of protection and subsidies from the Japanese government for Toyota to become competitive, and about 60 years for it to become one of the biggest manufacturers of cars in the world. And of course, as he shows in a couple of his books, including Kicking Away the Ladder, the United States itself was one of the most protectionist countries in the world from the 1870s through the First World War. And what I like about this new book is it's a nice textbook. It really is a user's guide and a way for people to get introduced to economics without all the baggage that comes with an intro econ course, although I still recommend that as well, partly because there's a little more detail, and partly because if you're living in a religious society, you should learn the state religion. But I want to give just one example, because today is the Scottish independence vote. And this is an example of why Ha-Joon's work is so important and why public education on economics is so important. Because here you have the country of, possibly a country, a potential country of 5 million people voting on whether or not to declare their independence, and yet they have decided, or at least the authorities have decided, that they're going to keep the British pound. And if this cannot be seen as a political compromise, like, for example, staying in NATO might be, this is just a lack of knowledge. If anybody, the people knew what that means, to have another country's currency, and when you're declaring independence, they might as well give the UK the appointment of their Supreme Court and half of their parliament. So this is why public education is so important. And with that, I turn it over to Ha-Joon.
Right. I think that lost the PowerPoint. So you could, yeah. Well, thank you, Mark, for that very kind introduction. Yes, today I want to talk about this book, Economics User's Guide, and to put it a bit more pompously than I do in the book. I mean, the reason why I wrote this book is because I wanted to maybe like democratize economics. No, because there's this strange phenomenon in which people have strong opinions on all sorts of things. Gay marriage, Iraq, climate change, abortion, you name it. Without having any qualification to have a strong view, I have my strong view on U.S. foreign policy, but what do I know about international relations? I took one course in international relations back in 1983 when I was an undergraduate student in Korea, and the crusty old professor was using textbooks from the early 60s. So what little international relation theory I know is 50 years old. This was one when Eisenhower was Nixon was vice president. I mean, this is ancient time, but I still say things. And I'm sure you all say very strong things about this and that without having the qualification and have no problem with it. But when it comes to economics, non-economists say, oh, too difficult, too technical, not for us. Leave it to the experts. And the experts, of course, say that, yeah, that stuff is so difficult, you don't understand it even if we try to explain it to you. Yeah? So just forget it, leave it to us. Yeah, that we will take care of it, that you get on with your life. Yeah? But why? Why do we do this? Yeah? What's so special about economics? And Mark actually already has given the answer, because economics has become modern religion. It is playing the role that Catholic theology played in medieval Europe. Yeah. It looks terribly difficult because they never tell you in plain language. Yeah, in the old days, people couldn't understand the Bible because it was all written in Latin. And in that way, they are controlling you. Yeah, so in my previous book, 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism, I basically wrote a professional suicide note and said that 95% of economics is actually just common sense. Of course, made to look difficult by the use of mathematics and jargon and charts and even the remaining 5% can be understood in its essence. Well, if not in all technical details, if someone bothers to explain it in an accessible way, which is what I try to do in this book. Yeah, so I pulled all the stops I can. There's Gone with the Wind. There's The Simpsons. Well, at least Ned Flanders, my favorite character. The Simpsons. There's the My Fair Lady. There's the Mary Poppins. Chapter 8 starts with Mary Poppins. A whole page of it. But being accessible doesn't mean that I'm trying to give my reader some kind of baby version of the idiot's guide to economics. 7 things you need to know about inflation. 3 things that you have to remember about the world economy. I don't do that. I take my readers very seriously, and I think about all sorts of difficult issues, hopefully in an understandable way, like what is economics, like what is the ethical foundations of economics, whether economics can be a science, whether we can separate economics from politics and so on. So I take my readers very seriously. I don't say, well, these are things that you don't need to know. Just remember this. No, I don't do that. I try to engage my readers to the most fundamental issues. And in that sense, the book, this is the cover of the British edition, tries to offer you something completely different, as Monty Python used to say. Yeah, and actually you can see it from the table of contents. I mean, it contains a lot of things that you don't normally see in economics books. I mean, how many books have you read that seriously discusses the definition of economics? How many books have you read that discuss economic history? Of course, there are books on economic history, but if you pick an introductory book on economics, you will never see more than a few pages of history of capitalism. I have a whole chapter discussing different schools of economics. I'll talk about that a bit later. And then I talk about certain topics that tend to be neglected in current debates on economics, like production and work. Another different feature of this book is that it emphasizes the importance of what I call real life numbers. You know, non-economists have this mistaken conception that economics is a number subject. And indeed, if you look at economics books, it's full of numbers. But economists actually do not know any numbers. Because, I mean, if you have a friend who has a degree in economics, ask him or her what is GDP of the United States of America. Maybe he or she will know that, but probably that she wouldn't know what the GDP of the world is. What proportion of that is produced in China, and or in the United States. Yeah, of course, you don't need to know any of these numbers. You need to know only one thing, Google. But even to know what to look for, you need some feel about these numbers. You need to have some sense of these numbers. And if you do not have this, you can end up having a very distorted view of the world. So let me give you a beautiful example. At the height of the so-called Eurozone crisis, in which Greece was a particularly kind of desperate case, there was this dominant narrative, mainly coming out of Germany, that Greece's problem is that people are lazy. You know, they party and do not take work seriously, and then they leech on hardworking Germans and the Dutch. They need to buckle up. Yeah? They need to work harder and pay the debt and so on. If those people actually bother to look up the website of the OECD, which is the club of the rich countries based in Paris, they would then realize that actually Greeks are the hardest working people in Europe. Greece has the longest working hours in Europe, 30% longer than the Germans, 40% longer than the Dutch, who are officially the laziest people in the world. They have the shortest working hours. No, I like it, Why should you work all the time? Yeah, so if anyone is lazy, it's the Germans. It's not the Greeks. Greece's problem was problem of productivity. And to fix that, I mean, of course, there's the bigger problem of a single currency covering countries with very different conditions, but even within that, Greece's problem was that of productivity, and the discussion should have been about investment and infrastructure and R&D and education and skills and so on. Instead, it turned into a morality lecture. You irresponsible, lazy people, you will burn in hell unless you... Yeah, well, don't laugh. You Americans do the same with the Mexicans. You call them lazy? Mexicans work 25% longer than you do. Actually, Mexicans have the longest working hours in the whole of OECD. They work even longer than my fellow South Koreans, who are supposed to be mindless worker ants. Yeah, they took us over like a few years ago. Yeah? So what are you talking about? Yeah, it's just one example, but these numbers, you need to know these numbers. I mean, you don't need to remember them, but you should have seen some of them, and then have the feel of what they look like. And my book tries to offer. Of course, there are 209 or whatever number of countries in the world, and I'm talking about many different aspects. So I try my best to give numbers about as many different types of countries as possible. So I don't entirely talk about Europe or Asia, rich countries, poor countries, but there's a limit to what I can do. But I do my best to give a range of numbers to familiarize you with these things. Even while doing so, however, I emphasize that numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt, maybe even a bag of salt. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German writer and scientist, once famously said that everything factual is already a theory. Data is collected with a theory in mind. You don't mindlessly collect data. Yeah, so let me give you just one example. GDP, gross domestic product. This is the economist's preferred measure of a country's output in a given period. And there are a lot of interesting details about how these numbers are constructed, which is explained in the book, but that's not what I'm going to talk about here. In GDP, you do not include household work and care work, mostly done by women, without pay. That if you cook for your family, if you take care of your elderly parents, they are not counted. The usual justification is, oh, they are not transacted in the market, but how can you know how much these are worth? Well, you can begin with guess what they might have been. Suppose that you are trying to hire someone to do your work, you will have to pay that person a certain amount, so you can actually guess what that might be. And more importantly, statisticians that are collecting GDP data go out on a limb to estimate the value of other non-marketed activities. For example, when you live in your own house, that you are actually consuming a certain amount of housing service. But you don't pay rent to yourself, and therefore there is no monetary transaction. So it's similar with the household work. But then these statisticians actually impute value on that. So why are they not doing it for women's work? And this work, according to most estimates, account for about 30% of potential GDP, existing GDP. So if we added that, the output will be much bigger. More importantly, that the women's work will be more valued. But then they don't do it. Now, okay, I'm sure that someone has a reason, who, when they made that decision, maybe it's correct, maybe it's incorrect, but the point is that these economic numbers are not as objective as, I don't know, the temperature of this room or the weight of an elephant. Well, although, if you ask scientists, they say even those numbers are not that objective, but, let them worry about that. Yeah, talking of science, economists love to think of themselves as scientists. And they even write about this in newspapers. It's a bit infantile, but I've seen quite a few articles in New York Times by Harvard professors and so on, why economics is a science, as if anyone cares. No, but we should care actually, because by parading as scientists, they hold a lot more authorities than they deserve. Anyway. So they say economics is science, and therefore there is only one right theory, or at least one best theory, and anyone who disagrees with that theory is wrong. Yeah, so they would say, oh, the people who disagree with received economic theory of free market economics, they are like the people who believe that the earth was the center of the universe. But in the book, I show that there are at least 9, and quite a few more if you count differently. At least 9 different schools of economics, each with its own unique strengths and weaknesses. And the interesting thing is, I marked them in bold types. There are no less than 3 varieties of free market economics. Yeah, if it's science, how can you have 3 theories that justify the same thing? So the classical economics, economics of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, yeah, it may support the free market, but on a theory that is completely different from today's dominant economic theory that is called the neoclassical theory, because classical economics is a class-based theory. You know, they rhetorically talked about individuals, but in their theory, individuals play no role. Individuals are just acting out their class interests, their class habits and so on, yeah? Which is very different from neoclassical theory. Neoclassical theory, one thing you have to remember is that neoclassical theory economics is not the same as free market economics. Yeah? Because it contains this theory called theory of market failure, which can justify a wide range of government intervention. And when you apply this actively, like say people like Joe Stiglitz or Paul Krugman do, you can be quite, quote unquote, left wing. So don't confuse neoclassical economics with free market economics. However, it is true that these days most neoclassical economists are of free market leaning. But that theory is contrasted with the so-called Austrian theory, sometimes known as libertarian economics in this country, represented by people like Friedrich von Hayek. And the Austrian school justifies free market in a completely different way from the neoclassical school. Because if I put it quite simplistically, the neoclassical justification of free market is that people are rational, they know what they want, they know how to get it, so government shouldn't intervene. The Austrian defense of free market is completely different. The Austrians say no one really knows what's going on. So how the government thinks that they can tell people what to do? Yeah, because the Austrians are really big on uncertainty and limited rationality. They don't believe in these rational neoclassical individuals. And actually, I find it more convincing as a defense of free market. Anyway, the point is that there are no less than 3 different ways of advocating the free market. So can we really say that there's one correct theory? No. And to illustrate this point more graphically, I talk about what I call the Singapore problem, or life is stranger than fiction. If you read about Singapore from, I don't know, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist magazine, standard textbooks on international trade and development, you will only hear about its free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, 85% of housing is supplied by the government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of national output is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the world-famous Singapore Airlines. So I often put it to my students, give me one economic theory. Doesn't matter what it is, Keynesian, Marxist, neoclassical, Austrian, one economic theory that can explain Singapore. There isn't such a theory. Because it combines some extreme features of capitalism and socialism. Yeah, let me give you another example, which might be a bit less extreme, but no less instructive. Sweden, we think of it as some beacon of social democracy where everyone is equal and there's kind of fairness and so on. But you'll be shocked to hear that there's one family in Sweden called the Wallenberg family, spelled Wallenberg, but apparently you have to read it as Wallenberg. The Wallenberg family owns controlling stakes, meaning more than 20, sometimes 30% of shares, which basically allows you to control what goes in the company even though you don't have the majority. Controlling stakes in the companies whose collective market capitalization is, depending on the year, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Stockholm Stock Exchange. Even the US doesn't have that kind of family. Do you know one family that basically owns half the corporate world? No. But this country, despite that, is far more equal. Life chances they are much more evenly distributed than in the United States. So once again, I mean, the point is that you really need to look at real life economies because they all combine different features of different systems, different theories. It's not, but because you are never taught this, you are always taught that, well, there is American free market economy and all the rest who somehow have to follow the Americans, who are all somehow socialist or dictatorial, This doesn't really help us understand the world. Okay, as I said earlier, there are these many schools, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. And my view is that no theory can explain everything, so we need to let 100 flowers bloom. This is what Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist leader, once said, encouraging debate. Of course, he had an ulterior motive. He wanted all the flowers to bloom so that he can cut the ones that he didn't like. I don't have that intention. I don't have the power. I genuinely call for this diversity. Moreover, I go one step further and argue that they have to cross-fertilize. Because these different schools, even the ones that appear to be and are thought of as, even by the practitioners of the schools themselves, as mortal enemies, like Marxists and Austrians, they have a lot of common ground. And then I talk about this a bit more in the book, but there are actually quite a few examples of this cross-fertilization already in existence, quite a few obvious possibilities of this cross-fertilization. So this is what I argue for. Basically, I argue for pluralism in economics. And my advice to my readers is that you should try not to be the proverbial man or a woman with a hammer. There's this saying, sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, but we attribute all kinds of things to him, so that maybe it's not true, that he who has a hammer sees everything as a nail and starts banging everything. Nice, fine if it's a nail. It might just about work if it's a screw, but it will be totally ineffective if it's jelly, and it will be a disaster if it's an egg. But then once you acquire this particular tool, particular theoretical perspective, you keep applying it to places where you shouldn't. So my suggestion is that we should all get a Swiss Army knife. You need a range of tools. Of course, you need a sense to judge what to use where. And that is provided by studying history, politics, institutions, philosophy, ethics, and so on. So you need this rounded approach to economics. Well, I mentioned earlier that my book deals with some topics that are not usually discussed in economics books. Let me talk about just one as an example, that is work. Work is a very very interesting subject because it is these days talked about only when it is absent, only when there is unemployment. So we never talk about work itself because in the dominant economic theory, neoclassical theory, people are conceptualized mainly as consumers. And work is seen as an inconvenience, or in technical terms, disutility, source of disutility, which people have to put up with so that they can earn some income with which to buy things whose consumption gives them ultimate pleasure in life. Now, of course, there's that aspect of our existence, but it is only one of the aspects that we complex human beings have. We are also workers, among other things. Yeah, so what happens at work enormously affects us. Yeah. If you in poor countries, a lot of people work in positively dangerous places. They can get killed. And the death rate from work, from industrial accidents and so on, is something like 45 times higher in India than in America. Actually, the Indians risk their lives by going to work. I mean, work can be very dull. You've seen this the portrayal, the very early Christian portrayal in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. Work can be interesting. It can fulfill your potentials. Or it can be very stressful because your boss has introduced some device to control you, like that GPS machine in Amazon warehouses, or performance-related pay or whatever. The government might have liberalized labor market regulation, and your job security might have become very low, and then you are terribly affected psychologically. So, all these things affect us so fundamentally, and we spend so much time for work. Well, first of all, most people spend at least half their waking hours in work. Well, unless you're Dutch, because then you don't work. But some people have to spend hours and hours and hours just commuting. We are some unlucky black South African guy living in one of these black townships, which the apartheid regime built miles and miles away from the nice white cities because they didn't want to see black faces after the finished war. You could be commuting 3 hours each way every day. You could be commuting, spending up to 6 hours just commuting because there's no public transport. The roads are very bad, and you have to rely on this very unreliable transport services called taxis, which are minibuses that are run by these criminal gangsters, charging you an arm and a leg. And yeah, if you are spending 6 hours commuting, 9-10 hours working, you have hardly any time to sleep. Despite all this, we don't talk about work. I mean, this is a big problem. I mean, we need to talk about work. Okay, throughout the book, let me begin to conclude. Well, I have a bit more to go, but yeah. Throughout the book, I emphasize that economics is a political subject. Of course, most economists tell you that economics is a value-free science. Actually, if politics intervenes in economics, it ruins the economy. We should get rid of politics. Yeah, actually, economics used to be called political economy. Early economists actually knew that economics and politics was inseparable. And yeah, actually some of these older names are more honest. Before the Second World War, no country had Ministry of Defense. They all had Ministry of War. Yeah, because that's what they do. Do you know any Ministry of Defense which purely defends this country? Anyway, so the neoclassical economists, when they came to prominence in the late 19th, early 20th century, decided that we need to get rid of politics from economics. So they renamed the subject, and they've been using this allegedly apolitical criterion to judge social changes, which is known as the Pareto criterion. Pareto was a half Italian, half French economist who taught in Switzerland, and he came up with this principle that you cannot call a social change, even if it makes some people better off, if it makes even a single person worse off. Now this is a very serious principle, because it's a very important way of defending individuals against the tyranny of the majority. And in order to explain this, I use what I call the one finger story, which actually isn't in the book, so you are getting something extra for listening. The story goes like this, that someone knocks on my door tomorrow morning and says, "Oh, Dr. Chang, we have found this wonderful technology that will solve climate change problem overnight." I say, "Wow, that's great." They say, "The machine's built, it's all primed up, ready to go, but there's one little input that we need to start the machine, and we want you to have the honor of donating that input." I say, "What is it?" "Well, you guessed." Yeah? They say, "We need one live human finger to start the machine." Yeah, well, if I was convinced by the science, I would have run into my kitchen, cut my finger myself, and give it to them. I'm saving the world. But what if it's one arm? I think I still do it. But what if it's my life? What if it's the life of my family? What if it's 45 million South Koreans? Where do you stop? Yeah, so Pareto was very correctly concerned about this. So he said, we cannot call something an improvement if it hurts even one person. Unfortunately, the flip side of this principle is that one person can block a social change that will benefit a large number of people. Yeah, so to put it dramatically, if there's a country where one guy owns just about everything, and you tell the guy, well, if you give up 3% of your income, you can feed all the hungry children and give medical care to every old person in the country. If the guy says no, you have to accept it. Now, I'm not saying that it's an easy choice, because when you put it in an extreme way, it may seem obvious. Yeah, I mean, when I gave that 45 million Koreans story, you might have said, yeah, I mean, we need Pareto Principle. Yeah? When I gave that one rich guy example, you might have said, no, that's a rubbish principle. Yeah? So it's not easy, but what it is that whatever your view is, this still is a political position. Yeah? Because what it means is to accept the given distribution of income, wealth, and power is given, and not questioning it. Yeah, so that good example is Paul Krugman. Well, he didn't explicitly use this idea of the Pareto criterion, but in the late 1990s, he got into a debate with some of the American NGO activists regarding their campaign against American factories paying low wages in Bangladesh and in other poor countries. And Krugman said, look, you people are good people, but you are misguided. You are thinking as if these Bangladesh workers have a choice between a low-wage job and a high-wage job, but the choice they have is actually between a low-wage job and no job. Yeah, so they are better off working in this low-wage American factory. What are they talking about? Well, absolutely correct. But what if Bangladesh could have a land reform so that more people stay in the countryside and downward pressure on wages in urban areas is less? Yeah? What if we can abolish child labor so that other wages that are not undermined? What if you can use some industrial policy to create new industries, which will create higher paying jobs? Then maybe Bangladeshi workers will have a choice between a low wage job and a high wage job. Now you might say this is all a pipe dream, but this is actually what happened in my own country between the 1950s and 1970s. Land reform, introduction of compulsory primary education, which meant that parents would be locked up if they didn't send kids to school, and industrial policy, creating jobs in automobile industry, steel industry, and so on. Now, of course, if you take this to Mr. Krugman and ask him, he will probably say, yeah, great, you can do those things. But by not really talking about those possibilities, he was implicitly accepting that the current socio-economic order that prevailed in Bangladesh was acceptable. You should not do that. Yeah. Of course, your conclusion might be that given the situation in Bangladesh today, those things that Ha-Joon Chang just said happened in South Korea are impossible. Yeah, that might be the right conclusion. But it's the one thing to ask that question and conclude that no, you cannot do it. And it's another not even to ask it. In this context, I'm always reminded of this thing that this Brazilian bishop, Helder Camara, who was one of the leaders of left-wing Catholic theology, liberation theology, said. He said, when I give food to poor people, people call me a saint. But when I ask why these people do not have enough to eat, they call me a communist. Yeah? And in that sense, we have to all become a bit of a communist. No, we have to always, in poor countries, a lot of people choose freely to work in dangerous factories. Yeah, so that simply because they chose freely, do you accept it? You have to ask why these people are making these choices that I, as an American middle class person or rich Brazilian person, would have never made in a million years. What is driving them to make these choices? And there's always some underlying socio-economic order that is doing it, and you have to question whether this is acceptable. Once again, you may say this is acceptable, or at least has to be accepted because there is no realistic alternative or whatever, but you always have to ask that question. So in that sense, you cannot really forget politics when you are looking at economic issues. And indeed, I would argue that the political nature of economics goes even deeper, because as I discussed in the very first chapter of this book, titled "There's No Such Thing as Free Market," the very boundary of the economy is drawn politically. Great example is that child labor. In the 19th century, when some social reformers were agitating to introduce regulations on child labor, a lot of free market economists were up in arms. They said, this is going to undermine the very foundation of a free economy, namely the freedom of contract. These children want to work, these people want to hire them. What is your problem? It's not like these factory owners kidnap these children, use them as slave labor. They have to have freedom of contract. Yeah, so in the 19th century, a lot of respectable people were in favor of child labor. Fast forward 2 centuries, today, I haven't yet met a free market economy who say we need to bring back child labor to the American labor market in order to make it a truly free labor market. Well, one person almost said it. Some of you might remember that, Newt Gingrich. Yeah, he said poor children should work as janitors in their own schools. But today he was considered as a nutcase. This was the mainstream opinion 200 years ago, even 100 years ago. This shows that the reason why we do not accept child labor is not because of some economic theory, but because of basically the changes in our political and ethical values. Because today you go to a lot of developing countries, people will say child labor is fine. Yeah? There's no economic theory that tells you exactly where the boundary of the market should be. It's politically determined. 200 years ago, it was okay, perfectly okay to buy and sell people. Buy and sell children's labor services. In some countries that you can legally buy and sell human organs, even today. So, the very boundary of the economy, the very boundary of the market is politically determined. So when free market economists tell you, you shouldn't let politics intervene in economic, what they're effectively saying is that our boundary is somehow the correct boundary, and you want to redraw the boundary, and you are wrong. Yeah? We are scientists, we are politically motivated. You should never accept that. Okay, finally, my book is not just an explanation of economic theories and facts, it's also about the role of economics in public life. And in this regard, I have 3 sets of observations to make. First of all, never trust an economist. Well, that includes me, which then creates this kind of paradox that the ancient Greek philosophers used to love. That guy's an economist. He says that we should never trust any economist, but how do we trust that guy? Well, if we are not trusting that guy, we should trust all economists. I think those people had the time in their hands. Let them worry about it. I don't care. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that, unlike what they may have been telling you, professional economists do not have a monopoly of the truth. And it is entirely possible for people who are not professional economists to have sound judgments on economic issues. Sometimes their judgments may even be better because they are more grounded in reality. They are less narrow in focus. Indeed, when you think about it, the willingness on the part of ordinary citizens to challenge professional economists and other experts is a foundation of democracy. Yeah, all you have to do is to let the so-called technocrats run the country, why do you need democracy? Yeah, this happened actually during the Eurozone crisis. Yeah? The European Union was not happy with the way economies of Italy and Greece were managed. They parachuted unelected people into the position of prime minister. Mario Monti in Italy, and I forget his first name, but Papademos in Greece. Yes, give me Mario Monti any day over Berlusconi. It's the worst guy you can imagine, but there's a problem if you do that. Because you are then undermining democracy. So as far as you believe in democracy, you have a certain duty actually to learn some economics so that you can challenge these so-called economists or technocrats or experts. The second point is that, well, I'm not even going to pretend that I can read Latin. These are words apparently written on the walls of the city hall of Buda, the Dutch city famous for its cheese. Yeah, I don't know how they found time to come up with this pearl of wisdom doing all the cheese making, but they somehow managed. And here we are. Basically, this is not to say that you shouldn't have your own opinion. You should have your strong opinion, but be always ready to admit that in the end, your theory is not complete, the world is complex. It is possible that you're wrong. Only when you have that attitude that you can have a reasoned debate, because if one or both parties believe that we are absolutely right, then all you can do is to have a war or burn people on stakes or hang them. Finally, throughout the book, even while I constantly make proposals for reforms, I emphasize how difficult it is to change the economic reality. Sometimes the difficulty is for obvious reasons. The people who benefit from the status quo do not want to keep things up. So they lobby, they bribe, they use violence to defend their interests. But very often the status quo gets defended even without some people actually being evil. You don't need Dr. Evil sitting in the Starbucks tower for the world to be evil. Because there are two reasons. One is, in a capitalist system, the $1, one vote rule of the market drastically constrains the ability to drastically constrains the ability of people with less money to refuse undesirable options given to them. Yeah, so the poor workers in India choose to work in a toxic factory. Poor people in America, according to Ronald Reagan, choose to sleep on the street. It's a lifestyle choice. Nothing to do with them not having money. So in that kind of situation, poor people always have their options limited, which make their ability to change things weaker. Moreover, people are susceptible to beliefs that go against their own interest. In the old days, the Marxists used to call this false consciousness. And after the 1999, we call it the matrix. Yeah, in this country a few years ago gave me a perfect example of this. In the days following the debate on the so-called Obamacare, I saw this scene in the news in which some American pensioners were demonstrating against Obamacare with placards saying, "Government hands off my Medicare." Hello, Medicare is a government program. But these people have been so brainwashed by your insurance industry that they just cannot imagine how this nice program that benefits them all the time can possibly be a government program, because they have become convinced that no government program works. And so when you have a false consciousness of that level, then it becomes very easy to defend the status quo. Well, acknowledging the difficulties involved in changing the economic status quo should not make us give up the fight to create a better economy. Well, changes are difficult, yes, but in the long run, when enough people fight for them, many impossible things happen. 200 years ago, if anyone in this country argued that we need to abolish slavery, the nicest description that person would have got would have been unrealistic. Yeah, because at the time, the American economy was totally dependent on exporting continental tobacco produced in slave manned plantations in the south, so that they could buy manufactured imports. 100 years ago, Britain and many countries put women in jail for asking for vote. Actually, a lot of women at the time said, this is another example of false consciousness, we don't need vote. Why do we need vote when we have our husbands and fathers and brothers to represent our views? But now, in no country, the people with a straight face argue that we should abolish votes for women. Although you'll be surprised to hear that Switzerland gave women vote only in 1971. And actually, two law cantons held out until 1991. By refusing to give the votes to women in the local elections. Anyway, 56 years ago, most of the founding fathers of post-Second World War nations, interestingly including Israel, were hunted down by the British and the French as terrorists. 25 years ago, Margaret Thatcher famously said that anyone who thinks that there will be a black majority rule in South Africa is living in cloud cuckoo land, which is where she was living, so she should know. Yeah, so when enough people fight for it, these impossible things happen. And this is why I like to quote Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist political thinker, that we need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. But no other quote describes my point better than the following from Nelson Mandela, which said, "It always seems impossible until it's not." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ha-Joon. I wanted to see if we have some time. We can take questions from the audience. Everyone.
Yes, Ha-Joon. I can't really speak for everyone here. Sorry. Okay. I can't speak for necessarily everyone here in the room, but at least my experience in the field of economics, both undergraduate and graduate, I have not taken one economic history course. And I don't think a lot of economic departments around the country have that as a prerequisite. And I would ask you, I guess since you've kind of been on the front lines, why is it that economic departments don't want to, why do they refuse to teach economic history, which I feel like is something that a lot of us economists kind of don't have in our curriculum?
Okay. Yes, until the 1980s, actually, the most major American economics departments in their PhD program had at least the economic history or history of economic thought, sometimes both, as prerequisites. So this is actually quite new. In the last few decades, unfortunately, the profession has been taken over by these people who have this false notion that economics is a science. And for example, when they argue why we shouldn't teach history of economic thought, they would say things like, "Oh, do you know any physicists who read Newton's Principia?" Science means distilling knowledge from the past, and whatever people need to know from the old days will have been distilled already and be in the latest textbooks. All that students need to do is to read articles published in the last 5 years, maybe 10 years. They have this kind of attitude. When it comes to economic history, it's actually a bit more complex because the strange thing, I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but the strange thing is that in the economics profession today, basically the less related to the real world what you do is, the cleverer you are. Yeah. So if you are the cleverest, you will do mathematical modeling of something which is completely unrelated to the real world. Turing machines, information cascade, things that even I don't understand. Yeah, if you are a bit less clever, you will do econometrics. You will use statistics to analyze big data. If you are even less good than that, you will be, like I do, doing development economics. If you are even less good, then you do economic history. And if you are really bottom of the pit, you go around factories surveying managers. No, but this is a very strange attitude because when you go to, say, biology department, there are people doing research on living things with all kinds of tools. Yeah? So some people do DNA analysis, some people do anatomy, others study bone structure. Some others do nasty experiments with rats. Some of them build mathematical models of animal behavior. Others go and sit in the jungles of Rwanda, watching mountain gorillas, recording what they do. But these people are all called biologists because biologists are smart enough to know that living organisms are complex and you need to study them at many different levels. Yeah? and you can reduce them to DNA. You know, I've never met a biologist who say I'm superior because I study the more fundamental things like DNA. You know, but this is what the economists do. You know, I'm superior because I study more fundamental things like kind of the abstract choice theory rather than how the Toyota caught up with General Motors. You know, it's a sick discipline. It's a huge problem, and that kind of sickness actually creates this view that you don't need to know the institutional details, history, politics. The kind of things that CEPR has been very good at criticizing. The IMF used to say there's only one right policy. Economics is a science, so when you say, oh, you can apply that policy to Ghana or Brazil, are you saying that we should have different kind of physics or chemistry for Brazil compared to what they practice in Germany or United States? No. So that has been deactivated now. Fortunately, this is changing very, very slowly, but it is changing, so we have some hope.
I have a little bit of a contrarian, I have a little bit of a contrarian question. I mean, I guess I'm way over on the left, and I don't have a lot of use for the Chicago school, the Austrian school, the neoclassical people. But my question, though, it seems to me if you take your argument too far, we can get rid of political economy and turn it into only politics. And I'm wondering if there's anything that at least some of the economic schools you're talking about, are there any principles or any limitations or any rules that they provide that are useful and important to think about? So it isn't just a matter of opinion and political opinion as to what we do.
Yeah. No. I mean, I'm sorry if I gave you that impression. I mean, I've been emphasizing the political nature of the subject. So yes, I can see how it might have sounded like saying that it's all matter of political opinion. I mean, there are many important economic theories that people need to know. I mean, from many different schools. So. Despite my criticisms, neoclassical schools can give you very precise analytical tool to come up with certain answers in a very well-specified context. So if you want to regulate utility, you need neoclassical economics. But if you want to understand long-term technical change and structural change, you need to study people like Schumpeter and Marx. The Herbert Simon, the behavioralist school, have taught us how people actually think, rather than assuming that we are rational. They actually studied how people make decisions and have come up with very profound insights into our decision-making ability and how we build institutions and rules and organizations to cope with our limited rationality in a complex world. And Keynes has come up with this idea that that you cannot analyze the whole economy as if you are analyzing a single household or a single person. And there are all these things. So please don't get me wrong when I say politics. The subject is very political. There are these technical, like more economic things are there, but even they very often have underlying political assumptions. So, I'm sorry if I push things the wrong way a bit too far. But
Hi. First of all, pleasure to hear your talk. With a disclaimer that I'm currently employed by the World Bank.
I just gave a talk at the World Bank.
I know I missed it, but this is much better. You alluded earlier in your answer that previously the time, I've really had one pretty constrained view of the world, and now things are slowly maybe changing. But and when I talk to people inside the bank, they really are very convinced that we have a massive plurality of options, and we analyze the country context, and we design tailored solutions. I can't say I've made up my mind on my opinion on this, but I would be very interested to hear what you think in terms of how far these big institutions have actually come in practically amending the advice that they give and tailoring the solutions that they offer to countries.
Yeah. No, I can only talk about the areas I know about. For example, how World Bank and health sector has changed. I have no idea. But in terms of World Bank, until the 1990s, you couldn't even mention the word industrial policy. It was a dirty word. But now people talk about it. I mean, they try not to use the word. So you talk about industrial competitiveness or productive development, but they are talking about it. Thanks to people like Joe Stiglitz and Justin Lin. The IMF until like about 2003-4, its biggest goal was to open capital markets of developing countries. Now it doesn't say it. And in the recent period, on one or two occasions, it even recommended capital control to certain countries, like in the case of Colombia and so on. So, we've come a long way in that sense. But of course, that qualification. One, these are big organizations doing many different things. So it depends on which area you look at. So I'm sure someone can contradict me by saying, oh, but in this area they are still doing the same. And B is big, not just in terms of, especially the World Bank, kind of size, but coverage. So in some countries, the country office director might have a very open-minded approach. In others, it might be as if it's still 1985. So yeah, it's difficult to generalize, but in the areas I know, I think that there have been some positive development.
Hi, I'm a student studying economics from the land of mindless working ends, just like you. You mentioned, first of all, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that the economics is limited to the boundaries of politics. Have you ever thought it in the other way around, or do you think?
Have you ever thought that there needs to be a certain balance between those, or do you prefer a dominance over one of them?
Right, yeah. No, I mean, let me put it this way. I mean, it's grossly simplifying, but basically, we need both the $1, one vote principle of the market and one person, one vote principle of democracy at the same time. Now, the exact balance will have to depend on the country, depend on the area or policy we are talking about. So people would say that, yeah, we need more, say, democratic influence in areas like, say, healthcare than in, say, production of chocolates or motor cars. People might disagree with it, but I think most people actually have that view. In some countries, people might be more willing to accept market outcomes, like in the United States. In others, they are less willing to do that. Now, whether you say this is done correctly in a given context will depend on your own values. So, if I give you an interesting example, when I first went to study in England, I made this Swedish friend. Now, later I got to know Sweden quite a lot because I did quite a bit of research on the country. At the time, the only thing I knew about Sweden was Pippi Longstocking. And this guy was going on and on about how the Socialist Party is ruining Sweden and how our government is too big. Yeah, so I genuinely asked that, so what do you suggest? He said, oh, our government is taking nearly 55% of national output as taxes. Yeah? This has to be brought down to below 50%. So I said that you call yourself right-wing, if you said that in America or in South Korea, you will be branded a communist. Yeah? So the different societies have different values, and you cannot say that this balance is necessarily correct for everyone. And so yes, but I mean, we need both. I mean, you can't. The failure of socialism is a proof that you can't just run it down one person, one vote principle. The failure of free market capitalism is that you can't just run it on $1, one vote principle.
Thank you, Professor Chang. I've been working in the country of Bhutan for the past 4 years.
A country that tries to measure its development, the measure of gross national happiness upon gross national product. Now, you mentioned happiness in your book,
That's right.
and you're a little critical of that. But I'm wondering if you have an opinion about countries like Bhutan that are trying to go beyond GDP by taking a more holistic approach to development.
Yeah. No, actually, I mean, I'm critical of everything, so I have no particular grudge against the notion of happiness. But no, my biggest problem with this happiness studies is that what I earlier called false consciousness. Right? Yeah. So, and it's a dilemma. It's not an easy thing. Because if oppressed people say they are happy, who are you to shake them and say, no, you shouldn't be, yeah? Right, that's, if you put in terms of the matrix, that's the Morpheus approach, yeah? Get the guys out and show them reality, yeah? So that when you rely on this subjective happiness indicators entirely, you have that problem, yeah? So actually in the book I suggest that we need to look at a range of indicators, including both objective and subjective, and of course it gets really messy. One indicator I like is Better Life Index of the OECD, which contains like 47 or whatever huge number of elements. So you don't get neat conclusion like GDP. It's very clear. I'm $2 richer than you, kind of. So on this multi-dimensional indicator, you cannot get that kind of conclusion. So people tend to like this clean, quantifiable criteria, but I think we should try to get away from it. I often say that GDP or income might be the single best indicator of human welfare. So who said that we should use only one indicator? I think that I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. You have your hand up.
20 hands.
So the books of yours that I'm familiar with, Bad Samaritans and 23 Things, it seems that, and now, I don't know if I need this.
Probably not.
There you go. I feel I notice a pattern, unlike Thomas Piketty's recent book, a heretic of our state religion who's writing to the technocrats. Your books are not written to the technocrats. No. You aren't speaking to economists. Particularly now, it seems that you've written a textbook. What was the intent? What is your audience? If you could have your wishes come true for this book, what would the audience be and how would they use it?
Oh, audience, everyone. No, really, I mean, this could be used as an economics textbook, and I think there are quite a few bits that even professional economists would find new. But as I mentioned earlier, I have written this book with the hope that it will help democratize economics. So that I want everyone to read it and think about these issues. Of course, I mean, we are all busy with our own lives, you know. I mean, I sometimes joke that the most difficult job in the world is to be the responsible citizen of a democracy. Because we have to think about everything. You know? In our job, I mean, we do only one thing. But if you want to be a responsible citizen, you have to have an opinion on everything. Argentinian debt, you know, Chavez, Putin, you know, ISIS, North Korea, you know, where do you find the time? So, I mean, I accept that it's not possible for everyone to pay significant attention to the economic issues, but you know, these issues are so important that I felt that people should really kind of at least get rid of the fear that economics is too difficult for non-specialists.
Do you literally want this book to be a textbook in high schools or in college?
Yeah, actually, in some high schools in England, they have adopted this as a textbook. So, yeah, that's what I want. I mean, whether it will happen or not, I don't know. But yeah, that's what I want.
Well, we sure hope it does, and thanks for that great talk. And is there a book cited here?
Yes, yes. I want to thank you for the wonderful talk. I want to thank everybody for showing up. We have books for sale up front, and there'll be time if you purchase them now to come in and sign in back in here. Okay? Thank you very much.